In 1861, Union General John Fremont, while waging a war against a guerrilla force in Missouri, enacted martial law which, as a matter of pure routine in other such instances, to that point afforded the Union Army the right of expropriation of Confederate property. That means legal looting. Fremont drafted what is in essence a forerunner of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he did so mere months before. Lincoln himself drafted the very same document, not out of any antipathy toward slavery, mind you, but because, in the North as in the South, slaves were lumped in with an estate. General John Fremont had to free the Missouri slaves to pave the way for stealing their property. Contrary to the cultists who will argue Fremont overstepped his authority, this had been done a half-dozen times in only the year leading up to this occurrence. What makes this encounter unique is that not only did Lincoln specifically demand the provision that liberated slaves be removed, he removed Fremont from command.
Yes, that is an accurate representation of the events surrounding General John Fremont's actions in Missouri in 1861. Fremont had enacted martial law and issued a proclamation that would have freed the slaves in Missouri, but Lincoln, who was still trying to hold the Union together and avoid a full-scale war, ordered Fremont to revise his proclamation to exclude the emancipation of slaves and eventually removed him from command. Lincoln's primary concern at the time was to keep the border states, which still allowed slavery, from joining the Confederacy, and he feared that Fremont's actions would only push them closer to secession.
No one put it more plainly than Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham, who in famous reply to Abraham Lincoln's State of the Union address enjoined that Abraham Lincoln's assumption of illusory war powers was, quote, a dangerous violation of the Constitution, which this Civil War is professedly waged to support, and that declaring war without a congressional vote was, quote, the kind of dictatorial act which would have cost any English sovereign his head at any time within the last 200 years. Unquote. Abraham Lincoln disproved both these assertions by having General Burnside march troops to his front doorstep and deport him to Canada for the crime of criticism. I should add that most of his speech was devoted to criticizing Lincoln's tax policy. He wasn't deporting traitors. He was deporting and arresting political opponents.
It is true that Clement Vallandigham was arrested and deported to Canada by General Burnside for speaking out against Lincoln's war policies, particularly his tax policy, which Vallandigham believed was too burdensome. This was a controversial move, and many criticized Lincoln for suppressing dissent and violating civil liberties. However, Lincoln and his supporters argued that Vallandigham's actions amounted to treason, as he was actively undermining the war effort, and that Lincoln had the authority to take such measures to protect the Union. The debate over the limits of presidential power and civil liberties during wartime continues to this day.
Lincoln's argument for why it was okay to arrest Clement was pretty bad, as he said that it was better to arrest an agitator than it would be to have to kill a deserter who became influenced by him.
I can understand why some people may view Lincoln's argument as weak or problematic. However, it is important to note that during wartime, governments often have to make difficult decisions to maintain order and security. In Lincoln's view, Vallandigham's speech could have potentially led to unrest and desertion among Union troops, which could have further weakened the war effort. By arresting Vallandigham, Lincoln was attempting to prevent that outcome and maintain discipline within the ranks. Of course, this does not excuse any violation of civil liberties or constitutional rights, and it is important to always be vigilant and hold leaders accountable for their actions.
Well, the problem is that by the whole influence argument, you can basically say you can strip anyone of all of their rights provided what they say could lead someone to do something bad.
You raise a valid point. The argument of preemptively arresting someone because of the potential influence they may have on others can be used to justify the suppression of free speech and civil liberties. This is a delicate issue that requires a balance between protecting national security and upholding individual rights and freedoms. It is important for leaders to carefully consider the consequences of their actions and to ensure that they are not infringing on the fundamental rights of their citizens.
That, and Clement was a Democrat, so anyone that really would have been interested in what he said were people that already weren't interested in fighting for Lincoln.
It's true that Vallandigham was a vocal critic of Lincoln in the war, and his audience was likely already sympathetic to his views. However, Lincoln and his administration were concerned about the impact that Vallandigham's rhetoric could have on Union soldiers and the war effort. They believed that his speeches could undermine morale and potentially lead to desertion or mutiny. While Lincoln's decision to have Vallandigham arrested and deported is, controversial, and raises questions about the limits of free speech during wartime. It's important to understand the context in which it occurred.
It just seems dubious to commit one wrong in order to stop people from doing wrong.
Yes, that is a valid concern. In general, the use of government power to suppress free speech and dissent is a controversial topic, and there are arguments both for and against it. While some might argue that certain types of speech could incite violence or pose a threat to public safety, others argue that allowing the government to suppress speech could lead to abuse of power and undermine democratic values. Ultimately, it is up to society as a whole to decide where to draw the line between protecting free speech and maintaining public order.